Okay, folks, we might make a start. Welcome to our second webinar on the IPCC report. My name is Pat Brereton. I am a coordinator of the Climate and Society Research Centre at DCU, and I teach in the School of Communications. Tonight, we are focusing on the emissions challenge, reflecting on the IPCC challenge climate change mitigation report. So let me pass over to our chair, Caroline O'Doherty, who is the environmental correspondent for the Irish Independent. Thanks very much, Caroline. Over to you to take it all.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, and thank you for the invitation to be here and for the introduction. I'm very conscious that it's really only 48 hours since the last report came out, the IPCC report, and there's a huge amount to read and digest and analyse in that, and ideally we'd have a lot more time to have done that, but we don't. And I'm also conscious that right as we're meeting now, the DAO is gathering, if they're on schedule, and should be beginning their first substantial debate on our new carbon budget systems, and they may even get to a vote on it tonight. So there's a lot of things happening, and the best we can kind of do is try to keep pace with it, keep up with it if we can't keep ahead of it. So with that in mind, what we'll try to do this evening is we'll try to give you as comprehensive and comprehensible presentation as we can on the IPCC report. A little bit of background: it's the third in a trilogy of reports from the IPCC since last August. They've been working on them in preparation for about 7 years, and certainly scientifically consistently for about 5 years. The first report in August looked at the causes of climate change, the scientific background, scientific causes. The second one, just in February past, looked at the consequences, so the impacts on people, nature, all the ecosystems on which we depend. This one, the last one, looks at solutions. Now, what that boils down to, the few key points is that we should take away from it immediately is that, and some of these have been restated in the report, we are not on target to keep global warming to the relatively safe level of 1.5 degrees. Emissions are still rising, a little slower than they were in the past decade, or in the decade prior to this current decade, but still rising. To have a reasonable chance of staying within 1.5 degrees, we need to stop emissions rising by 2025 at the latest. That's what the report says. That's 3 years from now. They can't plateau when they get to that point. They have to fall very substantially. To do that, we have to dramatically and rapidly reduce our use of fossil fuels. And to do that, we have to find new ways of providing our energy, new ways of living, new ways of working. Now, a lot of that sounds quite familiar. So what we'll try to do tonight is look at what's new in the report, where the new emphasis are, where the new insights are, and what the nuances are. So with that in mind, we'll go maybe to our first panelist. Professor Diarmuid Torney will be known to a lot of you here. He's assistant professor in the School of Law and Government, but with a major focus on climate change politics and policy and governance. And he has worked on the Ireland's 5-year assessment report on climate change for the Environmental Protection Agency. So a lot of work going on both within the college and outside it. So maybe, Diarmuid, you know, your research, it focuses on climate change governance, I should say. So all the policies, the laws, the regulations that go into climate change, the institutions who are meant to implement those regulations and policies and laws, and society at large, who we hope are influenced and driven to respond to those. So looking at the report, what do you see in that? What does it say about how all those factors can feed into and drive the kind of transformative change that the report says we need to have?
Thanks very much, Caroline, and thanks for agreeing to chair the our webinar this evening. And I guess just to reflect on what you were saying to start off with about where we are and the limited time, I guess we've had to digest the 3,000 or so pages. I don't know about my fellow panelists, but I haven't got through all 3,000 or so of them yet. But you know, really, tonight is an opportunity for us just to give initial reflections and pool our knowledge. And so I guess what strikes me is particularly that section on enabling conditions, if you like, the governance, the institutions, the policies and laws. It comes towards the end of the summary for policymakers. There's a section on that, and I think that's quite significant, because the report reflects the changing landscape, the changing governance and policy landscape at international and domestic level, and calls out, for example, things like framework climate legislation of the kind that we have now in Ireland, and you referenced in your opening remarks, Caroline, the carbon budgets. That's part of the climate legislation. So I think it's interesting to see that called out in the summary for policymakers, and also there's some language around institutions, and we have new and evolving institutions in Ireland, like the Climate Change Advisory Council that was strengthened under the legislation last year. So all of that is called out as important parts of the jigsaw, and I think that's crucial, because we've got to the point now, I think, in the climate debate where we know what the technical pathways are, and we need to really get down to the business of figuring out how to implement it, how to craft policies, and really how to bring the public along with us, and that's an important part of what I've read in the summary for policymakers as well. There are important points around the need for engagement, for participation, and for equity and just transition. And I thought that the language in particular around equity was interesting. So there's a very strong statement about the 10% of households globally that are responsible for the highest per capita emissions are, if memory serves, responsible, I think it's for 35 to 45 or something in that ballpark of global emissions. We know the inequities of climate change, but it's still important, I think, to have those messages called out in the report. So I think that governance piece, that enabling piece is important, and it's good to see it reflected. But I think we still have a lot to learn, and really the test here, bringing it back home to Ireland, the test of that governance framework, I think is yet to come, because it feels like we're still really only at the starting blocks. And coming back to what you said, Caroline, we're only still in the approval cycle for the carbon budgets. We haven't really got into that, into the sectoral piece and into the real implementation. So I think there is a lot to reflect upon and to learn from the IPCC report for Ireland. So I'll leave it there for now, but look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say and to our discussion later. Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah. Thanks, Diarmuid. And even just when you're mentioning there about governance, I think one of the other standout statistics was, because we tend to think that the world is now awash with, legally binding agreements on emissions and so on. But I think, if I'm right, the figure they said was possibly about 53% of all global emissions are actually covered by legally binding. And as yet, we're not really sure how binding laws are, but even at the outset, that they would be covered by laws. So 53%, it's not all encompassing by any means. So yeah. Good points. James, I might go to you next. Dr. James Carton, also known in DCU well, Assistant Professor in Sustainable Energy, with a particular focus on hydrogen, which we'll let you talk to us about, but in low carbon technologies as well, and also sustainable energies, and also the founder of Hydrogen Ireland Association. So, and we're hearing an awful lot more about hydrogen. So maybe if you could tell us a bit, James, about what you saw in the report, about the role of technological pathways to emissions reduction and to the targets that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, so thank you, Caroline, and thank you for the invitation here. I think, first of all, this type of platform is actually really great to actually decipher these documents. You know, as Diarmuid said, 3,000-page document. The policy document itself is 64 pages. I can understand that no policy member will actually read 64 pages, so it needs to be summarized to 1 page or an hour of listening to these experts here. The first start, obviously, as you said, is that 1.5 degrees seems like something we can't achieve, and certainly not on our current policies. But from a technology point of view, you know, it is quite clear that renewable technologies are the way to go. I think reading the reports, so I read the technical document and I read most of the technical document and most of the policymaker document. The key thing that I came out with was that I wasn't reading anything new. It's basically been the messages from offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, storage, sector coupling, electrification. It was all there, and it's messages that I think people in energy, in sustainable energy, have been saying probably for the last 10 years. So that was maybe the first start thing. I was waiting for this good juicy bit of information that was new to me, and it wasn't there. It was the same messages. But it's amazing to actually have it all in one key document from a really reputable source. From a big thing that came out certainly from technology is electrification, I think, but that is the way to go with certainly with decarbonization of our energy sector. And I think it came out in every section almost, and that electrification is the way to go. But then it went into kind of you know, electrification cannot do it by itself. There are industries, there are sectors of the energy sector, such as high temperature heating, aviation, other long distance travel vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, etc., that are difficult to electrify. So what do you do there? And I think what came out of it was that sector coupling energy carriers with the electrification is really important. And obviously this feeds into my hydrogen area, which is great. But it's not just hydrogen, it's energy carriers. It's moving that energy from places where it actually said abundance and bountiful places of renewable energy to places where actually where need energy. And I think this was a really nice way of looking at it. There's bountiful areas in the world that have huge amounts of PV, solar energy, wind energy, onshore and offshore, and hydro. And that energy needs to be carried to places where are really reliant on imported fossil fuels today. So I think that was really, really stark for me to kind of just get that reassurance that that is true. I think we'll talk a bit about later, but one of the things which I saw there actually was something that it said that the idea of moving industry to where the renewables could be. I think that really sets Ireland up, certainly, and other countries, to a rural development opportunity or a decentralized opportunity. And I think that's something to kind of maybe policymakers might be interested in, certainly from, well, in Ireland's case, rural Ireland. So I think that's something to be important on. I think technology, I think the interesting thing on like biofuels came up. Biofuels was part of that something. If it can't be electrification, biofuels are important. But it did have the caveat that biofuels aren't the end solution for everything, because the pressure on land, and then implicated on the previous IPCC report on biodiversity, is certainly something we need to be very, very conscious of. So I'll have lots of other comments later on, but yeah, I just thought it was a very interesting read. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Yeah, when you mentioned there that maybe some of it wasn't all that new, what struck me, and I haven't read as much as you have, but that there was a lot of the old reliables, a lot of, you just use the wind, use the solar that we have, you know, and then peppered with things like solar radiation modification. So, you know, there were, you know, they are looking at the more, I suppose, more extreme technologies, but I think I'm right in saying that the emphasis comes down to what we know, or what we're nearly know on, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. Moving on to Sabrina Decker. Sabrina is Dublin City Council's Climate Action Coordinator. So she spent 10 years working on climate policy, and particularly on resilience in urban areas, which is mentioned in the report quite a lot, as a lot of emphasis on cities. And she's also author of the book, Cities Leading Climate Action, Urban Planning and Policy. So Sabrina, obviously Dublin City Council is a huge organisation in itself, but it also has huge reach into and influence on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who live and work and commute and go in and out of Dublin for all sorts of reasons, for leisure and for essential services. So as someone who has to sort of imbue those services and that organisation with climate policies, what's in the report for you in terms of what are the messages that you will be bringing back to your work and that need to be fed into the policies?
So while we're all on confessions, having read only the summary for policymakers, all 64 pages as best I possibly can, yes, it should be 1 page or less. It is challenging because it's dense. There's a lot in there. You don't want to miss anything. But I think from my perspective, having also read the previous two, the summary policymaker, and kind of just trying to go through the other chapters that are relevant to the city, and and as you said at the beginning, there's a lot coming at us and there's a lot to stay on top of. So that's a challenge in of itself. But what I appreciate about all three reports is the emphasis that's placed on subnational governments, so cities, and the role that we play. That to me is critical, and it is the research that I've held. So like James, there's nothing new in the sense that cities have this role. We are where everybody lives and everybody works, plays, everything. So we have a huge role in this. So short answer is yes, it contributes positively to the work that Dublin City Council is doing and needs to do, and to prepare for a low carbon and resilient future that we want. The longer answer to this, I think what's really important with the report is that it highlights the complexity and interconnected nature of the problem of climate change. And I think that comes out a bit more strongly when you read it in the context of the other three as well. I think the other piece that stood out to me is that there is a bit of a positive tone in that it highlights the direction we need to go. We know we're not in the right direction, so here's the direction we have to go. And there's a stronger emphasis on the systems mindset. And I think that stood out to me was that because the emphasis on cities is cities can't reduce their emissions without considering the impacts it has on its hinterlands and the impacts we'll have elsewhere. So we need to think about that. Like there needs to be thought about, if we're keen on introducing, like as the carbon budget is being debated, we know that for public sector, the sectoral place, the emphasis for us will be higher, and that we'll have a stronger responsibility as a city for transport emissions, but we can't address those without considering affordability of housing. And in terms of affordability housing, we have to also consider thinking about employment opportunities and education opportunities. So there's a whole systems place there. And just to say that in my role, we are looking at that, and we're trying to actually embed a health impact assessment into what we're doing around climate policy, because that is a systems approach. And I think in my own research, health came to the fore in there. And that seems to also be the answer to the question about how do we integrate into the policy system. And what I liked about the report and saying, it kind of called up that cost effectiveness can't be the decision tool that we use to make a decision about policy that has impacts on how we live, what the difference is in between, we need to understand why a person's making a decision. So it needs to consider the place-based impacts of policy. And I think the other piece that also kind of stood out with that is we have to work horizontally and vertically. Like Dublin City Council, I think we do a great job of working across teams, and it's not easy and we struggle with it. And it means things takes time, but we're doing that. And I think that vertical integration too, that the knowledge that we have about the challenges that we're facing and getting people to walk and cycle and to choose those active modes need to be given more consideration, because, this is kind of the other thing I was thinking about, is even as James is talking, like there's a risk that in the key messages that they're not cherry picked, that the key message to, say, this is the solution that we want, cough EVs, is the one we go with, when in reality it might actually not, because that puts a burden on the electricity system and supply. So, active travel is important. What's the barrier to that? We need to start thinking about those more holistically. So all departments of government need to be involved in that, and all levels of government. So no cherry picking, take a systems approach. It's going to take more time. We have to do it that way. We have no choice.
Thanks, Sabrina. And it's interesting, you may have noticed, or may have seen that the planning regulator came out with a report this week, critical of local authorities, particularly those, for their urban planning policies, but also, I think kind of pleading with them almost to realize just how much power and influence they do have to shape energy efficient communities. So it's just interesting to hear your take from the largest one in the country. Gina. Gina is currently the head of policy and advocacy for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, but she's also in Scotland, but she's also worked for a long time in Ireland here in various behind the scenes and in advocacy roles. So so much of this report doesn't feel like it's for ordinary people, but you are working with ordinary people, civil society, advocacy, bringing people along. And I'm wondering, you know, again, how will the report feed into maybe your campaigning and advocacy work and your communications with the public that you need to bring along with that?
Caroline, thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. As you can tell from my accent, despite being sat here in Edinburgh, I'm definitely not native. And it's been almost a decade since I've lived in Ireland, so it's very nice to kind of join and engage with you folk and find out what's happening in Ireland. I work for WWF, which is not active in Ireland, but is the world's largest conservation organisation, which is active in over 100 countries and has 5 million supporters globally. So it is in there and involved in a lot of these global processes. I work in Scotland, where there's lots of interesting parallels, I think, to what's happening in Ireland, but we've been on a very different emissions trajectory here. We've had a climate act since 2009, a better one in 2019, and we've already reduced emissions by about half versus 1990. So our targets for 2030 are 75% reduction on 1990 and net zero by 2045. So just to give a little bit of a sense of the kind of scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us here in Scotland and how many parallels there are. I think, yeah, you talked about seeing these as a trilogy, Caroline, and it's hard to look at this report in isolation. I mean, they very much come as a package, and they just reinforce to me fundamentally how much peril we're in and how much people and nature are already suffering on every continent, in every ocean, and that we're way off track to delivering 1.5 or even 2 degrees. I think 2 things struck me from the report. They're not unlike some of the stuff that Sabrina's just referenced. I think we can't cherry pick is one big thing. I think we cannot pick a favorite solution to climate change and advocate for that and that only. There is no tech bro silver bullet. There's no one technology to rule them all. We need absolutely everything. And this isn't just about technology at all. We need to throw the kitchen sink at it. We need renewables. We need massive electrification to underpin mobility, to underpin the electricity system and heat and buildings. We need to cut fossil fuel subsidies. We need to restore natural carbon sinks. We need to avoid deforestation. We need to change our consumption patterns, our diets. We need cultural innovation, social innovation. We need to change the finance system. That is a lot, and it's actually all in the report in some shape or form. And I think in many respects, that kind of feels overwhelming. It's like basically setting out an agenda for a whole-scale transformation of society. But I think what the report also does is show that the prize for doing that is absolutely enormous. Sure, a living, thriving planet is like the most fundamental of those things, and we need that. And if we don't do this, we are in serious trouble. And we also need to do this to improve the lives of 3.5 billion people globally who are highly climate vulnerable. But I think the report really sets out in black and white how irrefutable it is that doing this is economically better. It'll restore nature, it'll reduce inequality, it'll improve health outcomes, it'll improve global well-being generally. So, you know, there has never been more arguments stacking up for this kind of transformational change that we need to see. I think it's worth noting that the report was finalized, or all the evidence for it was finalized, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine even happened. So all those arguments, which were powerful enough as they were, are now supercharged, I think. So we can add, you know, enhancing global security and reducing the grip of petrostates to the many, many things that will be delivered if we tackle climate change. How can civil society do more to harness this? I think, you know, we need to amplify the messages in this report over and over again. I think a lot of people think this is old hat, and for many of us who work in the sector, there isn't all that much new here maybe, but it does pull together very, very powerfully all the kind of exciting solutions and progress that has happened over the last decade or so, particularly. And I think it seems old hat to us, but I think if you were to present it to the public, the agenda seems quite radical. Like people will be like, hey, this hasn't been written by social scientists and eminent global scientists. This has been written by WWF or Friends of the Earth or whatever. It almost feels like there's been such a transformation in the last decade that quite out there thinking that has happened has become the norm. It has become the scientific evidence base. I think civil society needs to get a bit better about drawing interconnecting crises together. So climate change is massively related to all the other crises of our times. And I think as a movement, we've often been a bit too insular, and it would be good if we can start reaching out more, finding allies in other places and at other levels, whether that's in people who work on poverty, but domestically or globally, or people who work on health or whatever, just finding connections to others so that we can continue to expand movement. But I guess also fundamentally to kind of emphasize, this isn't there is no civil society when it comes to climate change. We all have a role in every aspect of our lives. I'll leave it there. Sorry, that's a litany of things that we need to do.
Well, I think that reflects what the report says, all sectors, all actions. But it is interesting. One of the points they do make is that the idea that we can maybe, use biodiversity and use natural carbon sinks, all very important. But they won't make up for the rapid reduction in emissions that we need and by moving away from fossil fuels. So we can't dump it all on your type of organization or organizations who are working in your field. I should say, if anyone has questions, anybody who's tuning in, please do put them in the chat box. Is probably the best place to put them, and we'll try and get to them as much as we can. So I'm going to throw the questions out generally to the panel, because as Gina just mentioned there, the final facts on this report would have been put together last October or so, when the world looked very different. We were heading into COP in Edinburgh, where Gina is, and it's not close to Edinburgh, I should say, where Gina is. And there was maybe a feeling that slight optimism that maybe things were going to come together a bit better. And now all of a sudden a new year, and the second report came out, I think 2 days after the invasion of Ukraine, and now we're in an energy crisis and a war situation and so on. So maybe Diarmuid, if I can pick on you a little bit, does the report look different, do you think, when we're looking at it through the eyes of, particularly in Europe, but also in the US and the East, when we're looking at it through the eyes of crisis, which is an energy crisis and a stability crisis and political crisis in terms of political communications and political relations around the world? And should it look different, or does it stand apart from the world in which we're actually in?
Sure, thanks, Caroline. So picking up on something Gina said, the arguments in favor of moving away from fossil fuels, I think, are supercharged by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really has it's only just shone a light on what we should have known all along. And I'm talking in particular about our dependence on Russian energy in Europe. And so it's clear to me that the response to our dependence on Russian oil, gas, and coal shouldn't be to hook ourselves to some other producer of fossil fuels. That there's an opportunity, including a political opportunity, to use that rationale to speed up our energy transition, to speed up the ramp up of renewables and the phase down of phase out of our dependence on fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and to avoid locking in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think we've seen worrying signs in kind of the policy arena in recent weeks since the war in Ukraine kicked off, that there had been arguments around new fossil fuel infrastructure, LNG on the west coast of Ireland, for example. But I think stepping back from that and looking at it a bit more broadly, so I've been working on climate change in one way or another for about 15 years now, and there has never been a time when somebody has not been making a very strong argument that there was a more immediate challenge. So it was the global financial crisis, and then it was the recovery from the global financial crisis. And then for us here in Ireland, it was Brexit, and then a global pandemic, and now war in Ukraine. So there will, and that is not to downplay the magnitude of any of those crises, but I think we need to get better at maintaining a focus on climate change, because the world is not going to become less complicated, and there are going to continue to be multiple crises on the agendas of policymakers and impacting on society. So I think we need to find better ways to keep that focus on climate while we address the other challenges and crises that come our way.
Thank you, Diarmuid. Yeah, there has been a little bit of knee-jerk reaction, maybe, in terms of, renewed look at, say, the carbon tax and things like that. And yes, and maybe going back to coal and all those kind of discussions, maybe a little bit driven by a bit of panic over the current situation. But if I can mention, maybe James, to you, also a lot of people have been saying, well, this just shows we should have gone nuclear, 20 years ago, or at least 10 years ago, and it's still not too late. Is there much in the report about whether nuclear, which is ostensibly it's certainly a low carbon technology, may not be ultimately, if anything goes wrong, an environmentally friendly technology? But what's in the report about that, and what should we pay attention to in the report about that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing with the electricity system certainly is electrify it. So that was really important. That came out strong. Then it went into kind of the ways of doing it. One factor certainly within the production of electricity was the lock-in effect that Dermot mentioned on fossil fuels, and if it's not abated, that's a no-go area. Certainly for nuclear, as a Wexford man, where the nuclear plant was going to go, like nuclear is certainly, it's definitely, with. I think to the question there of what has changed since the report, the evidence went to this report, Ukraine has changed, and the knee-jerk reaction of actually of potentially going into, well, we used to get fossil fuels from here, let's get fossil fuels from somewhere else. And then also the knee-jerk reaction of, right, we can't get fossil fuels, let's just build nuclear because we think we know how to do that. So I think within the report, it really hasn't, it doesn't have that knee-jerk, but it certainly plays the role for nuclear across the world as part of the solution. But I think that was the key message, that it's part of the solution. I think certainly, I think CCS came into report very strong, and actually CCS came into report in relation to if we actually want to achieve our 1.5 degrees or even our 2 degrees, we do need CCS. But what also it kind of came into the fact that not every country has to capture carbon, but we do all have to pay into it somehow. So I think that will be the same for nuclear. It'll effectively, not every country has to have a nuclear power plant, but certainly everybody has to decarbonize. So that'd be that's effective the take on nuclear. It's definitely part of the solution. But just to one of the questions that came up here, which is also related to nuclear and electrification and batteries, is resources. And certainly it came into the report around resources and of minerals and materials and exotic materials. And it said in it that that multiple choices on, for example, electrification, biofuels, and energy carriers enables the system to be less reliant on specific minerals, for example. And again, this could fall into the nuclear side as well. So I think the report covers it broadly, but certainly there's knee-jerk reactions after happening since February, which I think governments will have to take into account, whether those knee-jerk reactions are something they should follow up with policy, quick policy, or to be actually thinking further down the line in relation to actually building up their energy systems and decarbonising.
Thanks, James. And just in case anyone's looking for carbon capture and storage, am I correct? They've changed it to CDR instead of CCS, so it's carbon dioxide removal, just to confuse us all. They don't make it easy.
Well, I just on that, Caroline, I think that's actually really good, because certainly the people confuse CCUS and CCS in every line of the work. And since it's called carbon dioxide removal, it's really specific. It's removing carbon, whereas carbon capture and utilization obviously ultimately goes back into the atmosphere at some point. So I think it's a really good acronym change.
Okay. About you on that one. Gina, maybe I could ask you to, it's a very, very broad one, but in terms of asking everyone to make changes, we talk about just transition in this country in a very kind of, I don't mean parochial in a bad way, but I mean local, because we can actually identify groups of people who've been hurt by climate policies, namely our peat workers in the Midlands and the associated communities there. But just transition goes bigger than that. We see it in the energy crisis and people in fuel poverty, and asking them to make changes or adjust to things that are happening because of climate policy. And it also has an international dimension as well, because there are countries who are suffering more than others, and there are countries who are better able to address climate action than others, and the wealthy, the rich-poor divide is very obvious, not just in classes, economic classes, but obviously in the global north and the global south. How do you even begin to present a world to the world, we need all these changes, when a lot of people quite justifiably say, but I can't, I'm not wriggling out of my responsibilities, I just can't. How do we address those kind of issues? How do we safeguard against asking the impossible of people who can't give any more?
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, that is one of the most fundamental and impossible questions to answer, but I'll have a stab. And I think this report is actually really strong on a lot of this stuff on inequality and the need for a much stronger lens of climate justice globally, and also just transition globally and domestically. And it's very strong that we're not seeing enough of the kind of climate finance flows that we need to see to emerging economies and developing countries to ensure that they're able to adapt and mitigate. And we already know from working group 2 how much suffering is happening as a result of climate change already. So nailing that climate finance piece globally, I think, is absolutely vital. There's been a lot of chat about just transition here in Scotland. Actually, it's been really interesting. And we set up a Just Transition Commission about 3 years ago, just off the back or at the same time as the 2019 Climate Change Act. And its role has been very much to kind of map out what long-term changes we're going to see, so that we can do more to plan better and I guess protect the most vulnerable in society as we transition. I think fundamental to this is the concept of transition, and I think just transition has often been used in some ways as a brake on transition. So we can't do this because we need to protect, lives and livelihoods, and it's often focused on the lives and livelihoods of people in extractive industries. And absolutely, we need to ensure that they are reskilled and retrained into jobs that are better for the planet, and also, are high wage, high skilled jobs. I mean, we need to ensure that happens. But we need to not forget that this is fundamentally a kind of a social justice issue. And I think the Just Transition Commission in Scotland has been really good at looking at this through a social justice lens. So how can we tackle climate change in a way that addresses the existing inequalities, for instance, around fuel poverty or access to transport? If we focus only on electric vehicles, for instance, there are many poorer households who don't even have access to a car. So we need to make sure that we're investing in public transport and active travel alongside that to really take a true justice lens. What else is worth saying about that? I think I'll leave it there for the moment.
Okay. Thanks, Gina. And that's, of course, one of those things is on the to-do list for government here too. It's the Just Transition Commission stroke Commissioner. I think they're playing around a little bit with what format to have that in, but I suppose the sooner the better. It would give confidence to people that they will be heard. Sabrina, maybe just because we've raised the question of there, what do we do about people who really can't do much? What about the people who just don't want to? And you know, some of the issues that you're dealing with in the city council area, you know, very contentious. The simple things of cycle lanes and so on. People just don't want to make changes. How do you get your head around that and approaching people and bringing them into the fold on that?
Who would not want a cycle lane? Don't know what you're talking about. I think just to kind of add to what Gina is saying, I think I'm Canadian, and I'm constantly, and I did a little bit of research on the just transition before joining Dublin City Council, and I think I want to view it as an opportunity, and I look at how British Columbia has looked at the several Trans Mountain pipelines and how it engages, and it's going through a period of truth and reconciliation with our First Nations. And I think this is where I view the opportunity. And perhaps why it is at a barrier and a bit of a stop is it requires us to have a lot of very uncomfortable conversations. And that's the challenge, is how do you have a very uncomfortable conversation with somebody who just doesn't want to change? And to be honest, I don't have an answer. Or maybe the answer is listening to understand what their barrier is, because and by listening, I'll use this as an example. I just happened to be chatting with somebody who was during the middle of COVID, actually, I think this was, I can't remember exactly, but the person was asking, you know, handing out pamphlets about the Sandymount route, and this was before everything else that happened, but somebody stopped. He was on his bike, turned to the individual and said, "I don't want this route because it'll cut my time getting to the airport." And I think there's a couple of things perhaps going on with this individual, and it's something that's been talked about, why do we want them to choose active travel, and people don't want to get out of their cars, because I think having these conversations constantly, somebody pointed out to me, sometimes the car is an extension of home, and it's an extension of that peace and quiet that they may or may not get at home. Equally, you kind of have to ask that person the other question of is that drive actually that peaceful and calm? Because I can't imagine that it is that serenity that you seek. So what are the other ways you can seek that serenity and peace that you need? Because that also reflects on the cycling infrastructure a little bit, because it is, as a cyclist, I'm stressed out all the time on the bike, because I'm constantly looking for the next person that may or may not hit me or send me somewhere terrible. But we have to take time to have those conversations. Perhaps that's the only answer, is having those conversations, understanding actually what the barrier is, because it's what a barrier is for you is not necessarily the barrier for somebody else. And I think that's something that's come down in my research and I'm trying to apply in practice. It was said best actually to me by somebody from Glasgow County Council, City Council, where there's times when you're the messenger and times when you're not, and who the messenger is. And I think that's important, is you have to be careful with who comes and who talks. And I think we have good examples of that in the city. And I think one strong example, and this links to the thing that, yes, there is actually climate action that somebody can do every day. When we started Eat the Streets last year, we spoke to the Grow Dome team that's now at DCU and doing a great job. And he actually chatted about how they actually had somebody, when they set up in Fatima, that it was somebody who was trusted in the community, went around and knocked on doors, because there was a bit of hesitancy from our side of, oh, this is going to get damaged, people aren't going to respect it. And because they had that engagement, when they actually had to take it down, people were upset because they had grown attached to, they respected that space. So I think it is finding that right person. And I think to anybody who says they can't do something, well, there is something, and I'm stealing from Stop Food Waste and from Odile in the EPA. It's stopping food waste is the climate action you can take 3 times a day. It is that simple. It's just watching what's going into your bin. And it is that we all can take those actions about being conscious of our consumption and what we're doing. And that actually has a knock-on benefit of not, especially in terms of energy, it sounds benign, but it is turning off the lights. Even if you had an energy upgrade, it's that's still energy and money that you're spending. Watching your water, I know it's free here, but it's still a resource that has a cost for us. Being mindful of what you're buying, those are the things that we can do. Like everybody can do it. Like if you don't want to ride a bike or walk, like think about it in other ways. There's always something.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabrina. We'll open it up to our viewers, because there's quite a few questions in the chat box there, and I think one of the early ones in was, not sure who it's from, but it's actually on a related issue, I suppose, because it's not just about maybe different viewpoints within a city, but there's a question there about looking for more detail on rural development opportunities within the context of the transitions that have to be made, and breaking down urban-rural tensions regarding climate change. Now, who would like to talk about that? I'll pick on James.
Yeah, my hand was up.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, my real hand, not my virtual hand. I think that was that's what I mentioned here, just in relation to renewable energy. In the report, it did say, there is going to be regions of the world and regions of countries that have like good wind infrastructure or good wind opportunity, and obviously solar as well may not be as much in Ireland, for example. But there leaves an opportunity there in the report, which it said that this might allow companies to move to those positions. And what that would do is that actually it brings in another point of resource management, and not having to put in the expensive resources of infrastructure to carry this energy to where it's used today. Instead, just use it where it's close to those resources. So I think in Ireland, there was actually a follow-on question there down the list actually related to this, which was in around like, is this something we can do in Ireland? The short answer is it's a perfect thing to do in Ireland. Like we have this Dublin-centric problem in Ireland. All our industry goes to Dublin, all our data centers go to Dublin. Dublin has a really good infrastructure, and then the rest of the country is just left in the winds, quite literally. But we can use those winds, and actually we can actually, infuse literally the rural area with jobs. Now, this comes into the community thing. Do they want the big infrastructure? Do they want the big industry? Do they want that? That's completely up to the community. I think literally you just have to go out and talk to the community. I'll give you an example, and I'll be short, but I was over on Achill Island actually just on the weekend, the good weekend with the sunshine, whatever weekend that was. I went there just to, there was an event on the island about community involvement on an energy strategy. And there's about 2,000 people on Achill, and about, 100 people were there in person, another 200 online. And they were asking about, we want to be part of a community. We want better transport access to the rural area. We want to reduce our bills. We want to reduce this, that. These communities are asking for these things to actually develop themselves. And then we were presenting also opportunity with offshore. And really their thing was actually, we want to get on this bandwagon. We want this offshore opportunity. If it's just out in the sea, we actually want to be part of that, because we can actually put it in a place where we'd like to see it, and not have a foreign investor put it where they want to put it, and not having to put massive power lines across the island, maybe do something else. So I think this is really just ask the community. And certainly there's a huge opportunity with renewable energy to move that renewable energy, or sort of move jobs, economy to places where there is potential for renewable energy.
Okay, thanks. Diarmuid, I think your hand is up there too. Did you want to say something on that?
I think Gina was before me.
She is,
directly relevant to James. I was going to talk a little bit more about agriculture and land use. So. Oh,
okay, yeah. Well, maybe Caroline, I can just follow up briefly on what James was saying to make a more general point. I noticed there was a question from, or a comment from Mal Roach in the chat about health. And I guess the more general point I wanted to make was that we need to get much better at telling a positive story about climate action, and that comes through in the summary for policymakers in this week's report in a few different places around. So there's a line about kind of social acceptance, and that the climate actions that align with existing norms and values are more likely to be successful, which seems common sense, but I still don't think we're very good at doing it. So you know, and particularly in you know, I'm most familiar with the discourse in Ireland that climate action is still very much framed in, you know, in media reporting. No offense or disrespect, Caroline, but it is often as a burden. You know, it's the default framing is around how much it'll cost, you know, carbon tax and so forth. And there are really huge opportunities. There are also big challenges, and we shouldn't shy away from being open and honest about those. But I think we also need to be better at telling that giving that more positive vision.
Thanks. And maybe Gina, you would come in there. And the reason I kind of shoved Diarmuid in ahead of you is because there's a question specifically for you as well, which might be relevant, because it does ask, what does Gina think about the report's handling of the biodiversity crisis and how we can better align policy responses to respond to both crises, so both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So I'll give you freedom to roam around those two questions.
Cool, and I'll roam into the, I guess, rural development, and also I think there was another related question in there somewhere, so I'll roam around a little bit. I think it's worth kind of reflecting on the really important role of what's called the AFOLU sector, which is agriculture, forestry and land use, in tackling climate change, and obviously also in protecting nature. So the sector is responsible for, I think the report says, something in the region of 13 to 20, roughly 20% of emissions, but it soaks up around a third of emissions. And I think action in this sector could deliver up to 30% of the emissions cuts that are required over the next decade, if I've read that right. So it has a very, very significant role to play in tackling the crisis. Some of that is about avoiding deforestation and the kind of supply chains and consumption patterns that drive that. Some of it is about restoring already degraded nature. So peatlands are the obvious example in Ireland. Also, we're, you know, massively underforested compared to other countries, and we face similar challenges in Scotland. But it's also about soil health and various other aspects of that. And I think, you know, the report, the last report more focuses on the impacts of nature, but this one does show that nature has a really, really fundamental role to play in the transition. And I think that's you know, that does resonate with people, and we need to make that message come across loud and clear. But I also, you know, the report also shows how important it is that we transition our agriculture system to a more sustainable model, and also emphasizes the role of dietary change in all this. Now, how do we do that transition to a more sustainable model? I mean, this is the thorniest issue around, right? And particularly in an Irish context, and we're not dissimilar here, you know, loads of jobs, loads of economic growth in the sector, and it is a really, really thorny and difficult challenge. I think it's really important that you know, farmers are supported through peer-to-peer learning and to kind of get to grips with the opportunities that will ultimately be available to them as land managers. So food production remains vital, but also we need to think about how people use their land for tree planting or for peatland restoration, and how they can be incentivized for that. I mean, there has been obviously a bit of a shift in terms of what the CAP does, but fundamentally a complete transformation in farming subsidies is what's necessary to deliver for climate and nature in this respect. So it's a really, really important sector. There's loads and loads of opportunities there. We're doing a lot of work on land-based skills at the moment, but who the messenger is and how you can connect with people, I think, is really, really vital. Farmers feel under attack, but they're also at the front line of climate change. So how do we kind of come together, I suppose, to co-create solutions? That's really, really important.
Thanks, Gina. There are two questions there, which there's a similarity between them to one degree. I might pounce on James, but Daniel Carr asks on the point of wind energy, and given our very ambitious targets and the fact that we have to scale up we want 80% of our electricity from renewables by the end of the century, and that's mainly wind, but also solar. Is there merit in setting up a semi-state company or to take over that rather than leaving in the hands of private companies, or is there merit in it, or is it possible? possible. And I think somebody else has sort of mentioned something similar about, well, it's more to do with the radicalization of scientists who are basically pushing for those who may be pushing for sort of a post-capitalist world. But I suppose it's that same kind of idea, you know, do we need to start take the private companies out of these technologies and out of the energy transition and put it in the hands of governments and in public ownership? So maybe that might be one for James to start with, and then anyone else can feel free to jump in.
What I would say certainly on Ireland's offshore potential is just that we've been lazy, politically lazy. There's policy has been completely a vacuum since 2003, since the first offshore site went in Arklow. There's just been nothing happening. That has changed only, 2021 effectively, with the setup of the with MARA, which is the body that's basically going to organize for the East Coast offshore. But yes, offshore floating, which is really Ireland's opportunity in this and next decade, is only beginning to start. So certainly the problem isn't that somebody doesn't have the money. The problem is that the risk for investing in Ireland today is too high. So they prefer to go to where Gina is and go to Scotland and invest. Like the example, Gina, maybe you know more about it, but the example in Scotland was that they opened up an auction for 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, and the 25 gigawatts, 5 times more, actually won the auction. Ireland effectively are aiming for 5 gigs on the East Coast, and potentially, if it's allowed, 1 gig on the West Coast by 2030. But I would suggest with Ukraine, with energy security, with opportunity, investment banks, pensions from all over the world would flood into the West Coast of Ireland to put in gigawatts, tens of gigawatts in the West Coast. And obviously that would have to be managed and organized and made sure that, rural West Ireland wasn't destroyed and the oceans weren't destroyed. But certainly it's not a lack of business, it's a lack of want. That's effectively. I'll stop there. You're muted, Caroline.
Sorry about that. Does anyone else want to come in on that, or is it just, is it too, has the sort of ship left the port on that one, in that it is private investment that runs these things and the state's job is regulation rather than actually taking over the running of them? Diarmuid, maybe?
Thanks. That's a nice, easy question. So there were, I guess, a couple of linked questions in the chat around the themes of capitalism and growth. But in my mind, they're slightly distinct questions. So capitalism is about the ownership of the means of production, to use that terminology. So that's the question that you're, I think, posing, Caroline. And I guess my answer to that is that time is against us, and we don't have the luxury of trying to design a completely new economic system from scratch. We need to start from where we are. And so I can understand the arguments of people that say we need to completely overhaul the economic system, but I think my perspective on it is that the scale of the challenge, or the urgency of the challenge, is such that we really need to get going and get, along the lines of what James was talking about, get investment of whatever kind we can as quickly as possible into new clean technologies. And the question about growth is a slightly different question, because at least in principle you can have a growth, steady state or degrowth economy in either a capitalist or a non-capitalist system, at least in principle. And there were a couple of questions about degrowth and whether it's mentioned or where it's mentioned in the report. And unless I missed it, I don't think it's in either the Working Group 2 or Working Group 3 summary for policymakers. But the concept does feature in the underlying reports in both cases. And I think that tells us something about we know those summaries for policymakers maker documents are agreed signed off line by line by governments. And I think that tells us something about the power of governments in the process to frame the narrative, but also the resistance to anything that looks like degrowth. So I think we have a distance left to travel in terms of having that debate.
Thank you very much, Diarmuid. And in talking about distance travel, we've already travelled just past the hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Look, there were lots of questions there we didn't get to, and Jean Moore was recommending a link to a paper from the National Economic and Social Council there on agriculture and climate change. So if people maybe want to follow up on that, it's a good pointer, maybe go to that website. And there's lots of questions there, about state involvement, state policies, and concerns, about how everything is being tackled. So it does show there's an awful lot of concern out there and a lot of interest. So if we can say one thing, if we haven't already delved into any of the IPCC documents, yes, they are scary, and not just for the content, but the way they're presented and the wording. So they do take a bit of time. I would say to people, try not to be put off, maybe persevere a section at a time, 64 pages in the summary. Take your time and go through it, but once the language, I think once you get into the flow of the language, people shouldn't feel intimidated to say that the contents are scary enough without being put off by the language. So I'm going to hand back to Pat just to say, as I mentioned at the start, the debate in the Dáil on the carbon budget, it was going on certainly 5 minutes ago, so I presume it's scheduled to go on for another hour or so. So if you haven't had enough of this, go and tune in and find out if our great public representatives have actually been paying attention to anything that's in the report, and any of the people like yourselves, the experts who've been talking about this for a long time. So thank you very much. It was great to hear from you all, and I'm going to hand you back to Pat now.
Thanks, Caroline. That was fascinating, and thank you to all the panelists. I learned a lot. I took so much notes here. I can't keep up with you all. Really sort of good, we need good stories, and we need to tell a good story and keep it on the agenda, as everyone was saying. So just signing off, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed just so much in the chat. We could write a book on all the questions that are coming up. So there's an awful lot of material here. So thanks for everyone. Hope you've engaged, and as Caroline said, keep reading this 600-page document, and let's find out ways of solving the problems. Thank you, and signing off. So see you again sometime. Thank you. Bye.